Dean Rollins slid a contract worth millions across the table while Ranger stood between them, growling softly. The contract sat on the old front desk beside a rusted lantern and a loaded check worth more money than Walter Hayes had seen in his entire life. Snow tapped against the lodge windows. Ranger stood between Walter and the businessman in the expensive coat, ears low, growling deep in his chest. Outside, the Smoky Mountains disappeared into fog. Inside, one signature could erase every debt Walter carried, or destroy the only place that had finally given him a reason to stay. So what would you have done? Taken the money, or protected the lodge? The saw blade screamed through oak like it was angry at the world. Walter Hayes flinched before he could stop himself. Nobody noticed at first. The lumber mill was always loud, metal rattling, forklifts backing up, men yelling over machines that never really shut off. But Walter felt every sound different from everybody else. The sharp crack of wood hitting concrete, the hiss of hydraulic pressure, the deep thump of heavy pallets dropping onto the floor. To him, noise didn't stay noise for long. It turned into memory. The night shift dragged through another freezing Tennessee evening while rain tapped against the sheet metal roof. Walter stood near the cutting station with his gloves damp from oil and sweat, feeding warped boards toward the saw line. His shoulders ached, his knees burned. 58 years old and still working jobs built for younger men. Then it happened. A stack of untreated pine slipped off the loader behind him. The crash exploded through the building. Walter hit the floor instantly, hard, one arm over his head, breathing fast, eyes searching corners that weren't there. For half a second, the lumber mill disappeared. Different noise, different heat, sand in his teeth, radio chatter screaming in his ear. Contact left. Move, move, move. Walter! The voice snapped him back. He looked up from the concrete floor. Workers stared at him. Somebody killed the saw line. The whole building suddenly felt too quiet. Walter pushed himself upright fast, embarrassed already. "I'm good," he muttered. Nobody answered. A younger guy named Travis avoided eye contact completely. Another worker slowly picked up the fallen boards without saying a word. Walter brushed sawdust off his jeans with shaking hands. His supervisor, Kenny Doyle, walked over carefully. Not angry. Worse than angry. Concerned. "You okay there, Walt?" "Yeah." "You sure?" Walter nodded too quickly. "Board just caught me off guard." Kenny glanced at the others before lowering his voice. "That's the third time this month." Walter looked away. Rainwater slid down the high windows. Outside, darkness swallowed the mountains whole. "I can still work," Walter said quietly. Kenny sighed. "I know you can." That answer hurt more than if the man had yelled. An hour later, Walter sat inside the small office near the loading dock, while Kenny filled out paperwork under flickering fluorescent lights. The heater rattled in the corner, but barely worked. Walter kept facing the door without thinking about it. Kenny noticed. He noticed everything. "This ain't personal," he said finally. "Company's nervous. Liability stuff. After what happened tonight..." Walter stared at the stained floor tiles. "You're firing me." Kenny rubbed his jaw. "I'm letting you go before somebody gets hurt. Maybe you. Maybe somebody else." Walter gave a dry laugh with no humor in it. "Hell of a way to say Merry Christmas." Kenny slid an envelope across the desk. Final paycheck. Small. Too small. "You were one of the best workers I had," Kenny said. "You know that, right?" Walter nodded once but didn't trust himself to speak. Because hard work stopped mattering once people got nervous around you. That was the truth nobody said out loud. By the time he stepped outside, the rain had turned colder. His old Ford pickup waited near the edge of the lot under a dying security light. Rust spotted the doors. One headlight was dimmer than the other. The transmission slipped every morning until the engine warmed up. Walter opened the passenger door first. Ranger lifted his head immediately. The old shepherd mix had been sleeping under a blanket stretched across the seat. Gray fur around his muzzle, one torn ear. Smart brown eyes that always searched Walter's face first, before anything else. "Hey, boy." Ranger climbed across the bench seat slowly and pressed against Walter's chest while he got in. Walter scratched behind the dog's neck. "You still got more loyalty than most people." Ranger's tail thumped once against the seat. The truck struggled to start, twice, then finally turned over with a cough. Walter drove through the wet mountain roads in silence. Small towns passed by in pieces, closed gas stations, dark diners, pawn shops with neon open signs glowing in the rain. Everything looked tired, including him. At a red light, Walter caught his reflection in the windshield. Deep lines around the eyes, gray in his beard, heavy shoulders bending forward more every year. He barely recognized the man staring back. The trailer park sat 20 minutes outside town near the foothills. Mud everywhere from the rain. Half the porch lights burned out. Somebody's old washing machine leaned beside a ditch like abandoned junk nobody wanted anymore. Walter unlocked his trailer door while Ranger waited close behind him. Cold air hit them immediately. The heater had stopped again. Perfect. He tossed his keys onto the counter. 2 overdue bills sat beneath the door slot. Electric, lot rent, red letters. Final notice. Walter dropped heavily into the kitchen chair and stared at them without opening either envelope. Ranger sat beside him quietly. The silence inside the trailer felt heavier than the storm outside. After a while, Walter opened a cabinet. 1 can of soup, half loaf of bread, dog food running low too. He looked down at Ranger. The dog looked back without blinking. That nearly broke him. "You'd probably be better off someplace else," Walter whispered. Ranger rested his chin on Walter's knee. "There's farms around here. Bigger yards. Better food." The dog didn't move. Walter swallowed hard and looked away first. Around midnight, he finally fell asleep in the recliner, with the television glowing softly across the room. Then the dream came again. Heat, gunfire, smoke rolling through broken walls. Walter jerked awake, breathing hard, one hand reaching beside the chair, before he realized there was no rifle there anymore. Only Ranger. The dog stood with both paws against Walter's chest, whining softly. "It's all right," Walter muttered, but his voice shook. He got up and checked the windows. Locked. Checked the back door. Locked. Looked outside anyway. Nobody there. Still, he stayed awake another hour facing the front entrance while Ranger curled near his boots. At sunrise, rain drifted through the trees outside in thin gray lines. Walter opened the trailer door and found a single envelope resting on the steps. Cream-colored, official-looking. No return name he recognized. Ranger sniffed it once, then looked up at him. Walter frowned and tore it open. The first line made him stop breathing for a second. "Dear Mr. Walter Hayes, you have been named sole beneficiary of the Black Hollow Lodge property located in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee." Walter read it twice, then a third time slower. Walter stood on the trailer steps while cold morning wind moved through the trees around him. Ranger stayed close at his side, staring at the envelope like he understood it mattered. Walter read the letter again. Property transfer. Estate attorney. Keys available upon arrival. It felt fake, or worse, expensive. He folded the paper slowly and looked out across the muddy trailer park. Somebody nearby was already revving up an old dirt bike. A woman yelled at kids from a porch across the gravel road. Life kept moving like nothing had changed, but something had. even if Walter didn't know what yet. 3 days later, he pointed the old Ford pickup east toward the Smoky Mountains. The truck hated hills now. Every incline made the transmission groan loud enough to hear over the radio static. Ranger rode shotgun with his head near the cracked window, ears twitching every time a semi roared past. Walter barely spoke the whole drive. He kept expecting somebody to call and tell him there'd been a mistake. The farther he drove into the mountains, the narrower the roads became. Tourist cabins started thinning out. Gas stations disappeared. Cell service dropped to 1 week bar. Clouds hung low over the ridges like smoke trapped between trees. By late afternoon, Walter passed a weathered sign half hidden by weeds. Black Hollow Road. The arrow pointed uphill. "Doesn't look promising," he muttered. Ranger lifted his head immediately. The road twisted through dense woods for nearly 20 minutes before the trees finally opened. And there it was. Black Hollow Lodge sat against the mountainside like something forgotten on purpose. 3 stories tall once, maybe. Hard to tell now. Part of the roof sagged inward near the west side. The paint had peeled down to gray wood. Broken gutters dangled loose beside cracked windows darkened by years of rain and snow. An old wooden sign leaned sideways near the gravel drive. Black Hollow Lodge. Only half the letters still remained. Walter shut off the engine but stayed inside the truck. The place felt still, not peaceful, just empty in a way that made the air feel heavier. Ranger gave a low whine. "You hate it too, huh?" But the dog wasn't looking at the building. He was staring toward the lower level near the rear foundation. Walter noticed chains hanging across a basement door, partially buried into the hillside. Ranger's ears stiffened. Then the dog quietly growled. Walter frowned. That's new. The county office in town had given him an old brass key that morning. He grabbed it from the cup holder and stepped out into the cold. The gravel cracked under his boots. Wind moved through the pines overhead with a long, hollow sound. Up close, the lodge looked worse. Water damage stained the porch ceiling dark brown. One rocking chair sat overturned near the entrance like somebody left in a hurry years ago. Walter climbed the porch carefully. The third board creaked sharply beneath him. Instinct hit before thought. He shifted his weight fast and scanned the windows automatically. Clear left, clear right. No movement. His shoulders tightened when he realized what he'd just done. Even now, after all these years, Ranger pushed past his leg and sniffed beneath the front door. Walter unlocked it. The hinges groaned low and slow. Cold air drifted out carrying dust, mildew, and old wood soaked by mountain winters. The lobby opened before him in faded pieces. Stone fireplace, torn furniture, mounted antlers hanging crooked above the mantel, a chandelier coated in thick gray dust. But underneath the decay, Walter could still see what the place used to be. Families once checked in here. People laughed here. Somebody cared about this place once. Ranger walked inside carefully, nails clicking against hardwood floors. Then he stopped. The dog turned immediately toward the back hallway leading downstairs. Not curious, focused. Walter noticed it right away. "Ranger." The dog ignored him. He moved toward the chained basement door at the rear of the lodge and sat beside it silently. Walter walked over slowly. The chains were old but newer than everything else around them. Somebody had wrapped them there on purpose maybe 10 years ago. Maybe less. A heavy padlock hung near the handle. Walter crouched beside it. The metal smelled faintly like rust and damp earth. Then something shifted below, a soft metallic clink somewhere underneath the floorboards. Walter froze. Ranger growled again. Low, deep, not fear, warning. Walter stood slowly and stepped away from the door. "Probably pipes," he muttered. but he didn't sound convinced. An hour later, he drove down into the nearby town, hoping to find coffee and maybe answers. Black Hollow sat only a few miles away, though the place barely looked alive. One gas station, one diner, a hardware store with faded fishing stickers on the window. Most storefronts looked tired. At the public library, an older woman sat behind the front desk, organizing returned books into uneven stacks. She looked up when Walter entered. "You're not from around here." Her voice carried the soft mountain accent locals never noticed themselves. "No, ma'am." "What can I help you with?" Walter removed the folded estate letter from his jacket pocket. "I'm trying to learn something about Black Hollow Lodge." The woman stopped moving for half a second. That told him enough already. "You bought that place?" "Apparently inherited it." "Well," she leaned back slowly. "That's worse." Walter almost smiled at that. She introduced herself as Ellie Mercer and walked him toward a dusty county archive shelf near the rear wall. Old newspapers, property records, tourism brochures from decades ago. "Place used to matter," she said quietly, while searching through folders. "Back before the interstate moved farther west." Walter flipped through old photographs of the lodge covered in snow during better years, families standing outside, hunters posing with deer, Christmas lights glowing across the porch. Didn't even look like the same building. "What happened to it?" Ellie shrugged lightly. "World moved on. Town did too." She hesitated. "Though some folks say the lodge stayed open longer than it officially did." Walter looked up. "What's that mean?" Ellie slid one newspaper clipping across the table. "Winter shelter funding denied. Owner used to let drifters stay there sometimes. Veterans mostly. Men with nowhere else to go during storms." Walter stared at the article quietly. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the library windows. "People around here called it dead property after a while," Ellie continued. "Too far from tourists. Too expensive to fix." Walter nodded slowly. Dead property. That sounded about right. By the time he drove back up the mountain, darkness had already settled across the trees. The lodge looked even larger at night, and lonelier. Walter managed to get power running in one small section of the kitchen after resetting ancient breakers in the basement hallway. A single lamp glowed near the fireplace while rain hit the windows harder outside. He heated canned soup over a gas burner. Ranger never touched his food. The dog stayed near the chained basement door instead. Watching. Listening. At one point, Walter heard it too. A faint sound beneath the floor, metal scraping softly somewhere below. He stood immediately. Every muscle tightened. The old instincts came back fast, heart pounding, breathing shallow, eyes searching exits. Ranger stepped backward beside him without making a sound. Walter grabbed the flashlight from the counter and moved toward the hallway slowly, then stopped. Because suddenly he felt ridiculous. An old broken hotel, wind, pipes, mice maybe, nothing else. Still, he locked his bedroom door before sleeping, just in case. Around midnight, Ranger jumped onto the bed hard enough to wake him instantly. Walter sat upright, breathing fast. The dog stood facing the doorway, ears raised, silent. Walter listened. Somewhere deeper inside the lodge, a floorboard creaked. Walter stayed perfectly still in the darkness. Rain hammered the windows. Wind pushed against the old building hard enough to make the walls groan. But this sound had been different. Slow, heavy, like weight shifting. Ranger stood at the foot of the bed without barking. The dog's ears, Tamu, stayed locked toward the hallway. Walter reached for the flashlight beside him. Old habit. Never move blind. He eased out of bed quietly and opened the bedroom door inch by inch. The hallway beyond sat empty beneath weak yellow light from the kitchen. Nothing moved. Still, his pulse refused to settle. Ranger stepped ahead of him carefully, nails tapping soft against the hardwood floor. Walter followed, flashlight low in one hand. The lodge creaked around them like it was breathing. Halfway down the hallway, Ranger suddenly stopped beside the chained basement door again. The dog sniffed the crack beneath it, then looked back at Walter. "Yeah," Walter muttered quietly. "I know." Another sound came from below. Not footsteps this time, metal rattling faintly. Walter crouched near the door and pressed his ear against the cold wood. Silence. Then nothing. Finally he stood again, exhausted more than afraid. "Pipes," he whispered to himself. But he left the hallway light on the rest of the night. Morning arrived gray and wet. Walter barely slept another hour before getting up and dragging old cleaning supplies from a storage closet behind the kitchen. If he wanted to sell the place, he needed pictures. If he needed pictures, the lodge had to stop looking like a crime scene. By noon, he'd opened curtains in 6 rooms, swept broken glass into piles, and filled 3 trash bags with moldy blankets. Ranger followed him everywhere, except near the basement door. The dog still avoided leaving that hallway for long. Walter noticed something else, too. A few upstairs rooms looked cleaner than the rest of the lodge. Not fresh exactly, just maintained. Blankets folded neatly, dust thinner across the dressers. One room even had canned food stacked inside a cabinet only a couple years expired. Somebody had been using this place after it officially shut down. That thought stayed with him. Late in the afternoon, Walter found himself standing in front of a second-floor wall covered with old scratches and carved initials. At first he thought it was vandalism. Then he saw the dates. Different handwriting. Different knives, maybe. One carving stopped him cold. T. Chung. Jenkins, 3rd. Marines can't sleep either. Walter stared at it longer than he meant to. Below it, another message had been scratched into the wood years later. "You ain't the only one." His jaw tightened. Ranger sat quietly beside him. Walter reached out and brushed his fingers across the carved letters. Somebody had stood exactly where he stood now. Wide awake in the middle of the night. Head full of noise nobody else could hear. He understood that feeling too well. Outside, thunder rolled low through the mountains. Walter stepped back from the wall slowly. "Hell of a guest book," he muttered. The hardware store owner in town gave him the name Calvin Pike when Walter stopped in later looking for replacement fuses. "Old man used to work maintenance up there," the cashier said while ringing him up. "Lives by the lake now if he ain't dead yet." Walter found Calvin's trailer near dusk beside a narrow fishing lake wrapped in fog and pine trees. Rusted tools covered the porch rail. Old country music played softly through a cracked screen door. Calvin Pike answered, holding a coffee mug and squinting hard. He looked about 70, maybe older. "You lost?" Walter held up the brass key from Black Hollow Lodge. Calvin's expression changed immediately. "Well, I'll be damned." A few minutes later, they sat inside the trailer drinking burnt coffee while Ranger stretched beside an old propane heater. Calvin kept glancing at the dog. "Smart animal," he said finally. "He thinks he runs things. Usually means he's earned it." Walter almost smiled at that. Rain tapped softly against the trailer roof while Calvin stared into his coffee. "That place still standing?" "Barely." Calvin nodded like he expected that answer. Walter told him about inheriting the lodge, about trying to sell it, about hearing noises downstairs. Calvin listened quietly. Then he leaned back with a long sigh. "Place wasn't always empty," he said. Walter waited. "Owner used to let veterans stay there during winters, men down on luck, some from Iraq, some older than that. Didn't ask many questions long as they stayed sober and helped around the property. Walter frowned. Ellie mentioned something like that. Town didn't love it. Calvin shrugged. Some folks figured it scared tourists away. Others just didn't want broken men wandering around. Broken men. Walter looked down at his hands. Calvin noticed. You served? Walter nodded once. That explains the way you keep checking my windows. Walter hadn't even realized he was doing it. Calvin chuckled softly. Happens. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Walter mentioned the basement door. Calvin's smile faded. That's still chained up? Yeah. Calvin rubbed his jaw slowly. Owner sealed part of that basement off after a bad winter years ago. What happened? The old man stared toward the dark window. Couple veterans stayed during a storm. Power went out. Pipes froze. One man almost didn't make it. Walter stayed quiet. After that, Calvin continued, county inspectors started poking around. Shelter laws, fire codes, liability issues. Owner got nervous somebody would shut the whole place down. So he closed it. Officially. That word hung there. Officially. Walter noticed Ranger had lifted his head now, watching Calvin closely. There's more down there than old pipes, ain't there? Walter asked. Calvin hesitated long enough to answer without words. Finally, he stood and grabbed an old tackle box from beside the couch. Digging through it carefully, he pulled out a small, rusted tin container. Found this years ago out behind the kitchen. Walter opened it. Inside sat 2 old military dog tags wrapped beside a faded photograph of a German shepherd wearing a service vest. The edges had curled from moisture and time. Ranger stepped closer immediately. Walter stared at the picture. Something twisted hard inside his chest. He remembered dogs overseas. Bomb dogs, mostly. Smart enough to save lives. Calm under fire while grown men shook beside them. One shepherd named Lucky used to sleep beside the tents during mortar nights. Walter hadn't thought about that dog in 20 years. You keep these? He asked quietly. Calvin shrugged. Figured somebody should. Walter slid the photograph back into the tin carefully. Outside, darkness swallowed the lake almost completely now. Before Walter left, Calvin stopped him near the trailer door. If you're planning to sell Black Hollow, the old man said softly, make sure you know what you're selling first. Walter frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Calvin looked past him toward the mountains. Some places ain't valuable because of the land. Walter drove back through the rain in silence. Ranger kept one paw resting lightly against Walter's leg the whole way home. The next morning brought freezing rain and low clouds crawling through the mountains. Walter stood on the front porch holding a cup of burnt coffee while Ranger wandered the edge of the gravel drum, sniffing wet weeds. The lodge looked different in daylight now. Still broken. Still leaning toward collapse. But no longer dead. Walter hated that realization. Because dead things were easier to sell. By noon, he was knee-deep in repairs again. The ancient heating system had coughed itself awake sometime during the night, then immediately died before sunrise. Pipes knocked inside the walls every few minutes like distant hammer blows. Ranger stayed close while Walter worked in the basement utility room beneath the kitchen. The place smelled like rust, mildew, and cold stone. Walter knelt beside the old furnace, turning a wrench against frozen fittings when footsteps echoed faintly upstairs. He stopped instantly. Every muscle locked tight. Ranger's head snapped toward the basement stairs. A second later came the sound of a truck door slamming outside. Walter let out a breath slowly. Jesus. He wiped grease from his hands and headed upstairs. A black Silverado sat parked near the porch. Clean, expensive, out of place. The man stepping out of it looked the same way. Tall, mid-50s maybe. Heavy coat too nice for mountain roads. Perfect boots without a speck of mud on them. The man smiled before Walter even reached the porch. Walter Hayes? That depends. The man chuckled lightly. Dean Rollins. He extended a hand. Walter shook it carefully. Dean glanced around the lodge with the quick eyes of somebody measuring value instead of seeing history. Hell of a property. That's one way to describe it. Dean smiled again. I own Rollins Aggregate down in Sevier County. Gravel, limestone, hauling roads. We've got expansion plans moving through these mountains. Walter nodded slowly, but said nothing. Dean looked toward the ridgeline behind the lodge. You probably noticed this place sits near a future transport corridor. I noticed the roof leaks. That made Dean laugh louder than the joke deserved. I'll get straight to it, he said. I'd like to buy the property. There it was. Fast. Too fast. Walter folded his arms against the cold. You drove all the way up here for a building everybody else calls worthless? Dean's smile faded only slightly. Sometimes worthless land becomes useful land. How useful? Dean pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Walter looked at the number written across the top. His chest tightened immediately. It was more money than he'd seen in one place his entire life. Enough to erase debt. Enough to fix the truck. Enough to never step inside another lumber mill again. Ranger suddenly stepped between them with a low growl. Dean looked down. Well now, he muttered. Guess your dog doesn't trust businessmen. Smart dog. Dean slipped the offer back into his pocket calmly. I'm not asking for an answer today. But I wouldn't wait too long either. Why's that? Because these mountains are changing. Dean gave the lodge one last look before heading back toward his truck. Then he stopped. One more thing, he said. You should be careful sinking money into this place. Old buildings become expensive emotional attachments real fast. Walter watched the Silverado disappear down the road through drifting fog. The moment it vanished, Ranger relaxed. That bothered Walter more than the offer itself. An hour later, he drove into town again. Not for groceries this time. Answers. The county records office sat beside the courthouse in a narrow brick building that smelled faintly like paper and floor polish. Ellie Mercer was already there digging through archive drawers when Walter walked in. You look irritated, she said without glancing up. Met a man named Dean Rollins. Now she looked up. That explains it. Walter sat across from her while Ranger settled beside the desk. He offered money for the lodge. Ellie leaned back slowly. How much? Walter told her. Her eyebrows lifted immediately. That's not a normal offer. That's what I figured. Ellie turned her monitor toward him and typed a few searches into the county land database. Old survey maps appeared on screen. Colored lines crossed through sections of mountain property surrounding Black Hollow Lodge. What exactly am I looking at? Mineral surveys, Ellie said quietly. These mountains got explored pretty heavily years back. Walter frowned. For what? Mostly lithium deposits. Some rare minerals, too. He stared at the maps. You're telling me there's money buried under that place? Potentially. Ellie clicked another file. Problem is, most projects died before development started. Environmental pushback. Cost. Lawsuits. Who knows? Walter rubbed his jaw slowly. So why now? Ellie glanced toward the rain outside. Electric vehicles. Batteries. Everybody suddenly cares about mountain minerals again. Walter leaned back in silence. The lodge. The fast offer. The pressure. It finally started making sense. At least part of it. By evening, the temperature dropped hard. Walter returned to Black Hollow carrying replacement furnace parts and 2 bags of groceries. Ranger ran ahead into the lobby the second they entered, straight toward the basement hallway again. Walter shook his head. You really hate that door. The heating system groaned alive after another hour of repairs. Warm air finally pushed through rusted vents, weak but steady. Then it happened. A loud metallic bang exploded through the pipes overhead. Walter dropped instantly, one hand over his head, breathing fast. The flashlight rolled across the concrete floor. The basement vanished. Heat flooded his chest. Radio chatter crackled somewhere far away. Sandstorm skies. Sirens. Incoming. Move. Walter. The voice wasn't real, but Ranger was. The dog shoved hard against Walter's shoulder, whining low. Walter staggered backward into the wall, breathing too fast to speak. Another pipe slammed overhead. Walter grabbed the nearby shelf without realizing his own strength. The metal rack crashed sideways. Tools scattered everywhere. Damn it! He kicked the fallen shelf hard enough to dent it. Ranger barked sharply once. Walter froze. The dog stood directly in front of him now. Front paws braced, eyes locked on Walter's face. Not scared. Waiting. Walter's chest rose and fell violently. Then Ranger slowly pressed against his legs until Walter sank onto an overturned bucket. The dog stayed there, heavy against him, grounding him. Minutes passed before Walter finally spoke. "I'm all right," but his voice cracked badly. Rain hammered the basement windows while steam hissed through old pipes above them. Walter buried both hands into Ranger's fur, ashamed, tired, too old to still be fighting ghosts nobody else could see. When his breathing finally settled, he noticed something. Ranger wasn't looking at him anymore. The dog stared toward the far wall beyond the furnace room, toward a section covered by old plywood sheets nailed across the concrete. Walter narrowed his eyes. The boards didn't match the rest of the basement. They looked newer, like somebody had sealed something off years after the lodge was built. Ranger walked toward it slowly, then scratched once against the wood. Behind them, thunder rolled through the mountains, and for the first time since arriving at Black Hollow Lodge. Walter began wondering what exactly had been buried underneath it. The storm stayed over the mountains all night. Wind rattled the old lodge hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Walter barely slept. Every time the pipes knocked, his eyes snapped open before he even understood why. By sunrise, he was already downstairs again. Ranger waited beside the plywood-covered wall in the basement, like he'd been guarding it all night. Walter stood there holding a pry bar and a flashlight. "This is a bad idea," he muttered. Ranger thumped his tail once against the concrete. "Yeah, thought so." The first board came loose with a loud crack. Dust burst into the air instantly. Walter coughed into his sleeve while Ranger backed away from the cloud. Behind the plywood sat an older section of concrete wall with a narrow wooden door built into it. No handle, just heavy bolts rusted nearly solid. Walter stared at it quietly. This wasn't storage. Somebody had hidden this place deliberately. An hour later, Calvin Pike arrived carrying a toolbox and 2 sausage biscuits wrapped in paper towels. "You sounded serious on the phone." Walter pointed toward the hidden door. Calvin stopped dead. "Well, hell, you knew about this? Knew it existed?" Calvin rubbed his jaw slowly. "Never saw it opened." Walter nodded toward the bolts. "Help me." Together they fought the rusted hardware for nearly 20 minutes. Metal squealed, old wood groaned. Ranger paced nervously behind them the entire time. Finally, the last bolt snapped free. The door drifted open 3 inches by itself. Cold air spilled out. Not fresh cold, still cold, like a place untouched for years. Walter aimed the flashlight inside first. The beam swept across bunk beds, blankets, shelves, a tiny propane stove. Nobody spoke. The hidden room stretched wider than either man expected beneath the lodge foundation. Concrete walls, exposed pipes, folding cots lined against one side beside stacks of canned food long expired. A shelter. Not fancy, Not legal either, but built carefully, built to keep people alive. Walter stepped inside slowly. The air smelled stale but dry. Somebody had worked hard to seal the place from moisture. Calvin removed his cap quietly. Damn. Walter ran his hand across one of the bunk frames. Names had been carved into the metal. Ricky, Morales, J.T. Doc. Dates beside them. Mostly winters. Some almost 20 years old. Ranger wandered deeper into the room, sniffing carefully between the bunks. Walter found an old cabinet filled with medical supplies, bandages, flashlights, cheap blankets still sealed in plastic. Everything arranged neatly. Somebody had cared about this place. A clipboard hung beside the door with faded lined paper still attached beneath cracked plastic. Walter lifted it carefully. A list of names. No last names, just initials mostly. Arrival dates, medication notes, emergency contacts. Some lines simply read, "No family." Walter swallowed hard. Calvin stared at the list beside him. "Owner never talked much about it," he said quietly. "Just said winters up here kill lonely men faster than cold does." Walter looked around again. The room suddenly felt heavy, not haunted, witnessed. "You helped run this place?" Calvin nodded slowly. "Sometimes. You could have gotten in serious trouble." "We knew." "Then why do it?" Calvin looked at him like the answer should have been obvious. "Because they needed somewhere to go." The words hit harder than Walter expected. He turned away before Calvin noticed. Ranger stopped beside the far wall suddenly. The dog sniffed hard at an old floor vent half hidden behind stacked crates, then scratched once. Walter crouched beside him. Behind the vent sat another narrow compartment built between the concrete supports. Not large enough for a room. Storage, maybe. Walter pulled the rusted grate free. Inside sat old survey tubes tied with faded straps. Maps. Calvin cursed softly under his breath. Walter unrolled the first one carefully across a nearby cot. Topographic surveys, property boundaries, mineral markings. Even Walter could see the highlighted sections circling the land beneath Black Hollow Lodge. One stamp across the corner read, "State Geological Review, deferred." Another folder contained handwritten notes, transportation estimates, excavation routes, environmental objections. Dean Rollins suddenly made a lot more sense. "So the land really is valuable," Walter muttered. Calvin nodded grimly. "Looks that way." Walter leaned against the wall, thinking hard. Then he noticed a small wooden box sitting beneath the maps. Inside rested dozens of handwritten letters tied together with faded twine, most addressed simply, "Black Hollow Staff." Walter opened the first one carefully. "Thank you for not asking questions when I showed up drunk and shaking. You probably saved my life that winter." Another read, "I still sleep with the hallway light on, but at least now I sleep indoors." Another, "Tell the old man the coffee still tastes terrible." Walter let out a quiet laugh before he could stop himself. Calvin smiled faintly. "Franklin Barlow," he said, "owned the lodge back then. Meanest coffee in Tennessee." Walter kept reading. Some letters came from veterans now living in other states, some from widows. One included a photograph of a little girl standing beside a Christmas tree. On the back, someone had written, "Dad made it home because of Black Hollow." Walter lowered the picture slowly. For years, he'd believed surviving was the same thing as living. Work, sleep, repeat. Keep moving long enough to avoid falling apart. But this place had been trying to keep broken men from disappearing entirely. Ranger suddenly barked once near the entrance. Walter looked up sharply. Truck engine outside. Both men froze instinctively. A vehicle crawled slowly across the gravel above them. Walter killed the flashlight immediately. Silence swallowed the shelter. The engine idled for several seconds, then drove away again. Only after the sound disappeared did Walter breathe normally. Calvin looked uneasy now. "You need to be careful," he said quietly. "With Dean? With anybody sniffing around this property?" Walter glanced toward the maps. "Think they know about this room?" Calvin hesitated. "I think folks have known pieces of this story for years, but nobody cared while the lodge stayed dead." Walter looked around again. Dead. That word no longer fit. Before leaving, Calvin handed him one final envelope found beneath the letters. "Almost forgot." Walter opened it carefully. Inside sat a single handwritten page yellowed from age. The ink had faded but remained readable. "If you're standing in this room, then you probably came here carrying more weight than money can fix. Black Hollow was never built to make people rich. It was built so nobody froze alone." Walter read the line twice, then again. Outside, thunder rolled low through the Smokies. Ranger pressed quietly against Walter's leg while he stared at the hidden shelter beneath the lodge. And somewhere deep inside him, something that had stayed numb for years finally started to hurt again. Walter barely noticed the rain stopping outside. He stayed seated on the cot inside the hidden shelter long after Calvin left for the night. Ranger lay beside his boots, head resting across Walter's foot like he knew the old man might drift somewhere dangerous if left alone too long. The handwritten letter still sat open in Walter's hands. Black Hollow was never built to make people rich. It was built so nobody froze alone. Simple words. But they hit harder than anything Walter had heard in years. Because somewhere along the line, he had started believing survival was the same thing as living. Wake up. Work. Don't think too much. Keep moving. Die later. That had become enough, or at least that's what he told himself. The old furnace upstairs kicked on with a hollow groan. Warm air drifted weakly through the hidden room. Walter rubbed one hand over his face and finally stood. "Come on, Ranger." The dog followed him upstairs slowly. The lodge felt different now. Not smaller. Closer. Walter noticed details he hadn't before. The repaired hinges on certain doors. Extra blankets stacked neatly beside the lobby closet. Coffee mugs mismatched from years of donations. Somebody had spent decades patching this place together show for people nobody else wanted around. And somehow, that somebody had left it to him. The thought unsettled him more every hour. The next morning brought clear skies for the first time since he arrived. Sunlight cut through the pine trees surrounding Black Hollow Lodge and lit the mountain ridges gold. Walter stood outside repairing loose porch railings while Ranger wandered through wet grass nearby. For once, the silence felt peaceful. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. Walter almost ignored it. Almost. "This is Hayes." "Mr. Hayes, this is Mountain Valley Bank regarding your delinquent vehicle and housing accounts." There it was. Reality. Walter leaned against the porch post while the woman explained late fees, payment deadlines, possible repossession notices. Her voice stayed polite the entire time, professional, like she gave bad news all day long. He stared at his old pickup parked near the gravel drive. Transmission slipping. Rust climbing the wheel wells. Everything he owned felt one bad week away from disappearing. "You have 30 days before escalation procedures begin," the woman finished gently. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Understood. When the call ended, Ranger had already returned to his side. The dog sat beside him quietly. Walter scratched behind Ranger's ears. "You'd probably eat better with somebody else." Ranger immediately leaned harder against his leg. "Yeah," Walter muttered. "I know. By afternoon, Walter drove back into town carrying several of the old maps from the hidden shelter. Ellie Mercer met him again inside the library archive room, surrounded by stacks of county records. "You look terrible," she said. "Appreciate that. I mean worse than usual." Walter dropped the survey maps onto the table. "That enough proof your mountains are hiding something?" Ellie unrolled the documents carefully. Her expression changed fast. "These are original state surveys. You saying they matter? I'm saying companies pay a fortune to get copies of these." Walter sat heavily in the chair across from her. Ellie studied another page. Whoever owned Black Hollow knew exactly what was under that land. So why run a shelter instead of cashing out? Ellie glanced up. Maybe because money wasn't the point. Walter looked away without answering. Ellie noticed the exhaustion in his face, then softened slightly. "You all right?" He almost gave the automatic answer. "Fine." Instead, he shrugged. "Not really." The honesty surprised both of them. Ellie leaned back quietly. "My dad was Army," she said after a moment. "Came home different, too." Walter stayed still. He hated crowded rooms, slept with the TV on every night because silence made things worse somehow. Walter let out a faint breath through his nose. "Yeah." He never talked much about it either. That's usually how it goes. For a second, the archive room fell silent except for turning pages and distant rainwater dripping outside. Then Ranger suddenly lifted his head from beneath the table. The dog walked toward a shelf near the back wall and began sniffing around the lower cabinets. Walter frowned. "What's he doing now?" Ranger pawed once beneath an old storage shelf. Ellie crouched down first. "There's something stuck back here." She pulled free a dusty wooden frame wrapped partly in newspaper. A photograph. Old but preserved carefully. Walter took it slowly. The picture showed a younger Franklin Barlow standing beside a garage service bay during winter. Snow piled high behind him. Next to Franklin stood a younger man wearing a heavy military coat and helping somebody wrapped in blankets into a truck. Walter's breathing stopped. The younger man was him. 20 years younger, maybe, but unmistakably him. Walter stared at the photograph in complete silence. Ellie looked between the picture and Walter's face. "You know him?" Walter swallowed hard. "I remember this storm." The memory returned in pieces. Driving through the mountains after a construction job, seeing headlights off the roadside. A teenage kid half frozen beside an overturned Jeep near the pass. Walter had dragged him into the truck without thinking twice. Drove him through sleet to the nearest garage for heat. The old man there. Franklin Barlow. Walter looked down at the photo again. "I didn't even stay long," he whispered. There was something written across the back. Franklin's handwriting shaky with age. The soldier never asked for money. Didn't even leave his full name. Some men walk away after saving you. Some leave the door open behind them. Walter lowered the picture slowly. For years he had carried the feeling that his life shrank smaller every season, like the world had quietly moved on without him. Work injuries, bad sleep, bills, empty trailer, a dog who refused to leave him alone. That was his whole story now, or so he thought. But somebody had remembered him, not because he was special, not because he was rich, because one winter night long ago, he stopped his truck for a stranger. Ranger nudged Walter's hand gently. Walter looked down at the dog. "You knew before I did, didn't you?" Ranger blinked once. Ellie smiled faintly from across the table. Then Walter's phone buzzed again. Another message from the bank. "Final notice review pending." Walter stared at the screen. The warmth inside his chest faded fast, because whatever Black Hollow meant emotionally. The rain came back 2 days later. Not hard, just steady enough to soak the mountain roads and turn the lodge grounds into dark, slick mud. Walter spent most of the morning patching leaks in the west hallway roof, while Ranger followed him room to room, carrying old rags in his mouth, like he'd assigned himself maintenance duty. The place no longer felt temporary. That scared Walter more than he wanted to admit. He caught himself thinking about repairs before sales, thinking about winter insulation, water heaters, guest rooms, like maybe he was already staying. Around noon, Ellie arrived carrying grocery bags and a stack of printed flyers tucked beneath one arm. Walter climbed down the ladder slowly. "What's all that?" "An idea," she said. "That usually worries me." She ignored that and stepped inside out of the rain. Ranger immediately greeted her like an old friend now. Walter noticed that too. Traitor. Ellie spread the flyers across the front desk. Community dinner at Black Hollow Lodge. Help preserve local history. Donations welcome. Walter stared at them. "No. You didn't even think about it." "Yes, I did." "No." Ellie folded her arms. "Walter, this town hasn't had anything worth gathering around in years. People remember this place. They remember it falling apart. Some do." Walter shook his head and walked toward the fireplace. "I'm not running some charity event." "Why not?" "Because I can barely keep the lights on for myself." Ellie softened slightly. "That's exactly why you need help." The words landed harder than she probably intended. Walter bent to stir old ashes inside the fireplace even though there was no fire burning. Help? That word always felt dangerous. Ranger wandered between them quietly before settling beside Walter's boots. Ellie lowered her voice. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Walter let out a dry laugh. "That's usually how being alone works." Silence hung there a moment. Then Ellie crouched beside Ranger and scratched behind his ears. "You know," she said softly, "dogs like him usually pick one person and stay loyal for life." Walter stared into the empty fireplace. "Yeah. He trusts you completely. That makes one of us." Ellie looked at him carefully, then changed subjects before the air grew too heavy. "People would come, Walter, especially veterans." He didn't answer immediately. Outside, wind moved through the trees around the lodge with a low, hollow sound. Finally, he sighed. "One dinner. That's it." Ellie smiled instantly. "That's how every community project starts." "Pretty sure that's also how cults start." She laughed. And for the first time in a long while, Walter didn't mind hearing laughter inside Black Hollow. The next several days passed in motion. Walter repaired porch lights. Calvin helped clear brush near the gravel drive. Ellie organized folding tables borrowed from a church basement in town. Ranger supervised all of it. The dog wandered constantly between workers, checking rooms, following Walter everywhere like he was afraid the old man might disappear if left unwatched. Late Friday afternoon, Walter carried broken glass out behind the lodge while Ranger chased squirrels through wet grass nearby. Then suddenly, the dog yelped. Sharp. Pain. Walter dropped the box instantly. "Ranger!" The shepherd limped from behind the shed, holding one paw off the ground. Blood dotted the mud beneath him. Walter reached him in seconds. A jagged piece of old window glass had sliced deep across Ranger's pad. The dog whined softly, while Walter knelt in the mud, trying to steady his breathing. It wasn't a major injury. He knew that logically, but logic vanished fast. His hands shook hard while checking the wound. Too much blood. Too still. Too familiar. For one horrible second, his mind wasn't in Tennessee anymore. Dust, noise, medics yelling, men not getting back up. "Walter!" Ellie's voice snapped through the panic. She crouched beside him quickly. "It's okay. Look at me. He's okay." Walter blinked hard. Ranger licked his wrist immediately despite the pain. The dog was trying to calm him down. That realization hit like a punch. Ellie helped clean the cut inside the kitchen while Walter sat nearby, gripping the edge of the table too tightly. Ranger rested on an old blanket with his bandaged paw stretched out carefully. "You reacted like he'd been shot," Ellie said quietly. Walter stared at the floor. "I know." The kitchen stayed silent except for rain tapping softly against the windows. Finally, Walter spoke again. "When I got home after deployment, everybody kept saying the same thing." Ellie waited. "That it'd get better once I settled back into normal life." He laughed once under his breath. "Thing is, normal life never came back." Ranger lifted his head, hearing Walter's voice. Walter scratched gently behind the dog's ears. "I stopped answering calls, stopped going places. Couldn't sleep worth a damn. Half the time I still sat facing doors like somebody might come through them." Ellie leaned against the counter, quietly listening. "And then one day," Walter continued softly, "I realized this dog was the only reason I got out of bed some mornings." The confession hung in the room, heavy, honest. Walter looked embarrassed the second the words left him, but Ellie didn't laugh. Didn't pity him either. She simply nodded like she understood more than he expected. "That's not weakness," she said. Walter rubbed one hand across his jaw. "Feels like it." "No," Ellie replied softly. "Feels like surviving." Ranger nudged Walter's hand again. Outside, the storm finally started easing. That night, the lodge filled slowly with people for the first time in years. Local families, older couples, 3 veterans Calvin somehow dragged in from neighboring counties. The smell of chili and coffee spread through the lobby, while folding chairs scraped across hardwood floors. Walter stayed near the edges at first. Watching. Always watching. But little by little, the noise stopped feeling threatening. An older Marine named Curtis recognized the carvings upstairs and stood staring at the wall for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. Another veteran quietly slipped $20 into the donation jar before leaving. "Place matters," he told Walter on the way out. Simple as that. Near midnight, the last truck finally pulled away down the mountain road. The donation jar sat half full on the front desk. Not enough to save the lodge, but enough to matter. Walter stood on the porch afterward while fog drifted through the trees. Ranger rested beside him with his bandaged paw stretched carefully across the wood floorboards. "You know this is dangerous, right?" Walter muttered. Ranger thumped his tail once. "Hope, I mean." The dog stared at him calmly. Then headlights appeared far down the mountain road. 3 SUVs this time, dark-colored, expensive. They slowed near the lodge entrance before continuing past, toward the upper ridge trail overlooking the property. Walter watched them disappear into the fog. His stomach tightened immediately. Because men like Dean Rollins never brought company unless something bigger was coming. And deep down, the first snow came early that year. By sunrise, the mountains around Black Hollow had turned white beneath a hard gray sky. Wind pushed through the pine trees in long, violent bursts that rattled every loose window in the lodge. Walter stood on the porch watching the clouds roll lower across the ridge. Too fast. Storm movement. Bad one. Ranger limped beside him carefully on his healing paw, ears twitching toward the mountains. Walter felt it too. Pressure. The kind that settled into old bones before weather turned ugly. By noon, the sheriff's office issued warnings for road closures higher up the pass. Ellie called twice, telling Walter to come into town before conditions got worse. He looked around the lodge instead. Generators half working. Firewood low. Old pipes vulnerable to freezing again. Then he looked at the hidden shelter downstairs. Black Hollow had been built for storms exactly like this, so he stayed. By late afternoon, snow hammered sideways across the mountain roads. Visibility dropped so fast, The trees beyond the parking area vanished into white haze. Calvin arrived just before the upper road officially closed. His old truck fishtailed hard, pulling into the gravel lot. "You're either stubborn or stupid," he muttered, climbing out. Walter shrugged. "Bit of both." Calvin carried extra propane tanks while Walter hauled firewood inside. Ranger moved constantly between them, despite the snow collecting across his back. The dog hated stillness during storms, almost like he sensed trouble before people did. Around sunset, headlights appeared below the ridge. One truck, then another. An old church van finally crawled into the parking area, sliding through drifts. Ellie jumped out first. "We picked up 3 veterans stuck near the county line," she shouted over the wind. "Road patrol said shelters in town are already full." Walter stared at the van. Inside sat 3 older men bundled beneath blankets, looking exhausted and frozen. For half a second, fear flashed through him. Responsibility. People depending on him. Then training took over before panic could. "Calvin, get the propane heaters downstairs. Ellie, kitchen inventory. We ration immediately." His voice changed without him noticing. Clear. Focused. Command voice. The same tone he hadn't used in years. The veterans were brought inside quickly. One walked with a cane. Another coughed non-stop from the cold. The third barely spoke at all, just sat near the fireplace staring into nothing. Walter recognized that stare instantly. Shock didn't always come from combat. Sometimes life itself beat people hollow. Snow buried the lodge deeper through the evening. Power died around 7:30. The lights blinked twice, then darkness swallowed everything. Rosy orange lantern light replaced it minutes later, while wind slammed against the building hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Nobody complained. They simply adapted. Walter moved through the lodge checking rooms, sealing drafts with towels, monitoring heat levels exactly like running cold-weather shelter drills overseas. Ranger stayed glued to his side. The dog's paw slowed him slightly, but not enough to matter. "You should rest," Ellie told Walter quietly, while helping distribute blankets. He shook his head immediately. "Not while temperatures are dropping." Outside, conditions worsened fast. The mountain road disappeared beneath ice by full dark. Trees cracked somewhere deeper in the woods. Snow piled against the lodge doors. Then came the banging. Not gunfire. Not combat. Just frantic fists against the front entrance. Every head inside turned instantly. Walter reached the door first. A young deputy stumbled inside, carrying a nearly unconscious older man wrapped in a tarp. "Found him near the storage sheds downhill," the deputy gasped. "Truck slid off the road." The man's lips had already turned blue. Walter dropped beside him immediately. "Get dry blankets now. Ellie, hot water bottles. Calvin, help me move him." Nobody hesitated. The lodge transformed in seconds. Movement. Purpose. The older veteran near the fireplace even stood to help despite his cane. Walter guided everything automatically. Check pulse. Elevate feet. Dry layers. Slow warming. No sudden heat shock. Old survival habits flooded back without panic this time. Only focus. Ranger suddenly barked sharply near the rear hallway. Walter turned fast. The dog stood beside the back entrance, scratching at the door. "What is it?" Ranger barked again. Harder. Then shoved against the door with his shoulder. Walter opened it instantly. Snow exploded inside with brutal wind. At first he saw nothing. Then movement. A figure collapsed near the woodshed 30 yards away, almost completely buried beneath drifting snow. "Damn it!" Walter grabbed a flashlight and rope immediately. "I'm going out." Ellie caught his arm. "You can barely see out there." "Doesn't matter." Ranger pushed past both of them before anyone could stop him. The shepherd disappeared into the blizzard. "Ranger!" Walter followed instantly. Wind slammed into him like a wall. Snow burned his face. Visibility dropped to almost nothing beyond the flashlight beam. But ahead, he could hear Ranger barking through the storm. Short bursts, directional, guiding him. Walter reached the collapsed figure beside the shed moments later. Old man, still breathing barely. Ranger stood over him, already trying to shield him from the wind. "Good dog," Walter breathed. Together they dragged the man back toward the lodge, inch by inch through freezing snow. By the time they stumbled inside again, everyone moved automatically to help. No panic, no confusion, just people working together. Hours later, the storm finally eased near dawn. The lodge looked transformed. Lantern light glowed warm through frost-covered windows. Blankets covered sleeping bodies across couches and old guest rooms. Coffee simmered weakly in the kitchen. Walter sat alone near the front steps, exhausted beyond words. Ranger rested beside him, head across Walter's boot again. The dog smelled like wet fur, smoke, and snow. Walter scratched slowly behind his ears. "You saved him out there." Ranger closed his eyes quietly. For years, Walter had believed his military training only left damage behind. Nightmares. Distance. Reflexes nobody needed anymore. But tonight, those same instincts had kept people alive. That realization settled strangely inside him. Not pride exactly. Something steadier. Ellie stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know," she said softly, "most people would have left before the storm hit." Walter stared out at the mountains slowly brightening beneath fresh snow. "Yeah," he said, but Black Hollow didn't. By afternoon, cell phone service finally returned. Videos from stranded travelers had already started spreading online. Clips of the lodge sheltering people during the storm. Veterans helping veterans. Lantern light glowing through snow. One video showed Ranger standing guard beside the front door while snow piled around him. Comments were pouring in faster every hour. Walter barely looked at any of it. But somewhere beyond those mountains, other people definitely were. And when a black SUV stopped briefly at the bottom of the ridge road before turning around again, Walter understood something cold and certain. The storm left the mountains quiet. Snow still covered the ridges around Black Hollow Lodge, but sunlight finally broke through the clouds again. Meltwater dripped steadily from the porch roof while Walter stood outside splitting wood beside the shed. Ranger rested nearby on a blanket in the pale winter sun, his injured paw healing slowly. The dog looked older lately. Walter noticed things now he used to ignore. Gray fur around the muzzle, the slower rise after lying down. How Ranger sometimes watched Walter instead of sleeping, like he needed to make sure the old man stayed standing. Walter hated thinking about it. Inside the lodge, Ellie and Calvin sorted donated supplies that had started arriving after the storm videos spread online. Blankets, canned food, even handwritten thank you letters from strangers. Black Hollow had become visible again, and visibility attracted attention. Not all of it good. The black SUVs returned 3 days later. This time they parked openly beside the lodge. Dean Rollins stepped out alone carrying a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. Snow crunched beneath his boots while he climbed the porch steps slowly. Walter stayed where he was. Ranger rose immediately beside him. Dean glanced toward the dog. "Still doesn't like me. He's got decent instincts." Dean smiled faintly. "You look tired, Walter." "I look busy." Dean nodded toward the lodge windows glowing warm behind them. "Looks less abandoned every time I come up here." Walter said nothing. Dean opened the folder carefully. "I'm making one final offer." He handed over several printed documents. Walter looked at the numbers, then looked again. His throat tightened immediately. Millions. Not theoretical money. Real money. Enough to erase every debt he had ever carried. Enough for doctors. Medication. A warm house somewhere flat, and quiet, enough to make sure Ranger never wanted for another thing the rest of his life. Dean watched him carefully. "You could walk away clean," he said softly. "No more struggling. No more sleeping in broken buildings hoping pipes don't burst." Walter kept staring at the paperwork. "You know what happens if you keep this property?" Dean continued. "Developers come anyway. County taxes rise. Maintenance buries you. Sentiment won't survive reality." Walter folded the papers slowly. "Maybe." Dean's voice lowered. "But selling solves everything." That word echoed harder than Dean realized. Everything. Walter looked toward Ranger. The shepherd stood quietly beside him, watching the mountains. For one dangerous second, Walter imagined taking the deal. A small cabin somewhere warm. Vet care. Peace. No more collection notices. No more fighting. He was tired enough to want it. Dean saw the hesitation immediately. "You've already done more than enough here," he pressed gently. "Nobody would blame you for choosing yourself." Walter looked back at the lodge, at the repaired porch lights, the smoke rising from the chimney, the old shelter hidden beneath the foundation. Nobody froze alone. Those words came back again. Dean extended a pen. "All you need is a signature." Ranger suddenly stepped forward and planted himself between Walter and the paperwork. Not aggressive, just firm. Dean sighed softly. That dog really does hate businessmen. Walter reached down absent-mindedly, resting one hand on Ranger's neck. Warm fur, steady breathing, presence, the thing keeping him grounded. "I'll think about it," Walter said finally. Dean studied him a long moment, then nodded once. "Don't take too long." The SUVs disappeared down the mountain road minutes later. Walter stayed standing in the snow long after they were gone. That evening, the town meeting filled faster than anybody expected. Word about the mining proposals had spread after county survey crews started appearing along nearby ridges. Farmers, shop owners, older locals packed the small community center carrying paper cups of coffee and years of frustration. Arguments started before the meeting officially began. Jobs versus land, money versus history, progress versus survival. Walter almost didn't attend, but Ellie insisted. "You live there," she said. "That means your voice matters." Now he sat near the back wall beside Ranger, while county officials droned through presentations about economic growth and infrastructure opportunities. Then Dean Rollins stood. Smooth voice, expensive suit, perfect confidence. He spoke about opportunity, roads, employment, regional growth. Everything sounded clean when he said it. Then came the images. Projected maps showing future excavation zones spreading through the mountains around Black Hollow. Walter stared at the highlighted sections. The lodge sat right in the middle, a sacrifice zone. One official mentioned relocation possibilities for historical structures, like moving memory somewhere cheaper counted as saving it. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Then Dean looked directly toward Walter. "Some property owners," he said calmly, "have already been approached generously." Several heads turned immediately. Walter felt heat rise into his chest. Not anger exactly. Something heavier. Shame, maybe. Because part of him had considered it. Dean continued speaking while Walter stared at the floor. The room grew louder. People arguing now. Then suddenly somebody near the front muttered loud enough to carry, "Easy for rich folks to talk about sacrifice." A few bitter laughs followed. Dean's jaw tightened slightly. Walter looked down at Ranger. The dog rested against his leg calmly, despite all the noise. No panic, no fear, just trust. That simple trust broke something loose inside Walter all at once. Before he fully realized it, he was already standing. The room slowly quieted. Walter hated public speaking. Always had. Too many eyes. Too many exits to track. But he stayed standing anyway. Dean watched him carefully from across the room. Walter cleared his throat once. "I wasn't planning to say anything tonight." His voice sounded rough, honest. "I spent most of my life trying not to talk about much of anything." The room stayed silent. Walter glanced briefly toward the windows where snow still clung to the dark mountains outside. "When I came home from overseas," he continued slowly, "I figured eventually things would start feeling normal again." He laughed softly once. They didn't. Several veterans in the room lowered their eyes immediately. They understood. "I worked jobs, kept my head down, tried not to bother anybody." Walter swallowed hard. "Truth is, after a while you start feeling invisible." No one interrupted. "You stop believing people need you around." Ranger leaned quietly against Walter's leg. Then Walter looked directly at Dean Rollins. "But that lodge up there," he said, "it kept people alive before anybody cared what was under the ground." His voice steadied now. "Men stayed there because nowhere else would take them. Men people forgot." The room felt still enough to hear breathing. "And maybe some of us needed that place more than we realized." Walter paused, then added quietly, "I know I did." Silence followed. Not awkward silence. The kind that settles when people hear something true. Dean Rollins looked away first. After the meeting ended, strangers approached Walter one by one. A Vietnam veteran shook his hand silently. An older woman pressed $20 into the donation jar Ellie had brought. "Keep the lights on," she whispered. Outside, cold wind swept through the parking lot, while people slowly drifted home. Walter stood beside his truck, watching headlights disappear down the mountain roads. Ellie joined him quietly. "You did good in there." Walter shook his head. "I was shaking the whole time." "Still did it." Ranger climbed into the truck carefully, curling himself across the seat. Walter looked at the dog for a long moment. Tomorrow morning, Dean expected an answer. A signature. One decision separating survival from responsibility. Morning came slow over the Smoky Mountains. Fog drifted through the trees below Black Hollow Lodge while frost clung to the porch railings in thin white lines. Walter sat alone at the old front desk with Dean Rollins's contract spread open in front of him. Millions of dollars. Enough money to erase every hard year behind him. His trailer debt, medical bills, a newer truck, warm winters, a real retirement. For a long time, he just stared at the papers while Ranger slept beside the wood stove, breathing softly in his sleep. Then Walter looked around the lodge. The repaired lamps, the donated blankets folded near the wall, the names carved upstairs by men who'd once believed nobody would remember them. He thought about the storm, about the old veterans gathered around the fireplace drinking burnt coffee while snow buried the roads outside, about Calvin laughing for the first time in years, about Ellie refusing to let the place disappear quietly. And he realized something that scared him worse than poverty ever had. If he sold Black Hollow now, some part of him would disappear with it. Walter picked up the pen, then calmly crossed out the signature line. An hour later, Dean Rollins arrived expecting a deal. Instead, he found Walter standing outside beneath the porch light, with Ranger sitting at his side. Dean noticed the unsigned paperwork immediately. His expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Walter said. Dean stepped closer. "You think this place survives without money?" Walter nodded once. "No, I think it survives because people stop walking away from it." Dean exhaled sharply through his nose. "You can't save everybody, Walter." Walter glanced toward the lodge windows glowing behind him. "No," he said quietly, "but maybe you save one person at a time." For a second, Dean looked almost tired instead of angry. Then he took the folder back. "You'll regret this." Walter looked down at Ranger. The old shepherd slowly pushed himself upright and stood beside him. Maybe Walter would regret it someday. Maybe there would be winters where the pipes froze again. Maybe repairs would bury him. Maybe some nights the PTSD would still drag him awake, gasping in the dark. But regret wasn't new. He'd lived beside it most of his life already. Dean finally turned and walked back toward the SUVs. This time, Ranger didn't growl. He just watched. Like the threat had already passed. Spring came slowly to Black Hollow. Snow melted from the ridges first. Then the roads opened. Then people started showing up again. Not tourists exactly. Volunteers. Retired carpenters. Church groups. Old veterans carrying toolboxes in the backs of rusty trucks. Ellie helped Walter file paperwork turning the lodge into a nonprofit community shelter and recovery lodge for struggling veterans and travelers in crisis. It wasn't glamorous. Half the furniture still didn't match. The plumbing argued with everybody constantly, and the upstairs hallway leaned enough to make first-time visitors nervous. But the lights stayed on. That mattered. Calvin repaired the old stone fireplace. Ellie organized a tiny library beside the lobby using donated books from town. Someone else donated a commercial coffee machine that hissed like a tired dragon every morning. Walter fixed what he could with his own hands. The rest they learned to live around. One afternoon, county officials finalized a limited mineral lease agreement on a distant ridge nowhere near the lodge itself. Enough to create long-term funding without destroying the property. It wasn't riches, but it was survival. And survival, Walter had learned, counted for more than comfort sometimes. Months later, Black Hollow looked different. Still old, still weathered, but alive. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney every evening. Warm lights glowed through the windows at night. The shelter downstairs reopened officially, with 6 clean beds and emergency winter supplies. Nobody froze alone anymore. That became the rule. Walter moved into the small room above the office permanently. Ranger slept beside the door every night, like he'd assigned himself guard duty. The dog moved slower now, his muzzle nearly white. Some mornings he took extra time climbing the porch steps, but every evening without fail, Ranger made one slow patrol around the property before settling near the front entrance. Watching, waiting, protecting what was his. One cold evening near the end of October, Walter stood outside hanging a freshly painted wooden sign above the porch. Calvin steadied the ladder while Ellie laughed from below. "You missed a spot," she called. "I absolutely did not." "You absolutely did." Walter grunted under his breath and adjusted the sign one final inch, then climbed down slowly. The words stretched across the weathered wood in clean white letters. Some places survive because someone finally chose not to walk away. Nobody spoke for a moment. Wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the lodge. The mountains looked dark blue beneath the setting sun. Peaceful. Finally, peaceful. Later that night, Walter sat alone on the porch steps holding a cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. Inside the lodge, he could hear quiet conversation drifting through the halls. Dishes clinking, low laughter. Life. Ranger rested beside him with his head across Walter's boot. Walter scratched gently behind the dog's ears. "You know," he murmured softly, "I almost gave you away." Ranger barely opened one eye. Walter smiled sadly. "Good thing you're stubborn." The old shepherd thumped his tail once against the wood. Then headlights appeared far down the mountain road. A small car. Old. Rust around the wheel wells. It pulled slowly into the gravel lot and stopped. For several seconds, nobody got out. Walter stayed still. Then the driver's door finally opened. A young man climbed out wearing a thin army surplus jacket despite the cold. Mid-20s, maybe. Tired eyes. One duffel bag. He stood there looking at the lodge like he wasn't sure if he deserved to walk closer. Walter recognized the look immediately. He'd worn it himself once. The young man glanced toward the road behind him, like leaving might still be easier. Then Ranger slowly stood. His joints cracked softly with age, but he walked down the porch steps anyway, one careful step at a time. The young veteran froze as the old shepherd approached. Ranger stopped directly in front of him, then quietly leaned against his leg. Not demanding, not suspicious. Just there. The young man swallowed hard and lowered one shaking hand onto the dog's head. Walter watched from the porch without speaking. Because sometimes people didn't need speeches. Sometimes they just needed one living thing willing to walk toward them instead of away. Inside the lodge, the lights stayed warm against the mountain dark. And for the first time in a very long while, Walter Hayes no longer felt like a man waiting to disappear. Maybe that was the real thing Black Hollow saved. Not the building, not the land, not even the money buried underneath it. Maybe it was the simple reminder that broken people still deserve a place at the table. A warm light in the dark. Somebody who notices when they stop talking. Somebody who stays. Walter spent years believing survival meant carrying everything alone. But healing didn't start when his nightmares disappeared. It started the moment he stopped walking away from other people. And Ranger understood that long before he did. That old dog never cared whether Walter had money, a home, or a future figured out. He stayed anyway. Through the cold trailer nights, through the panic attacks, through the silence. Sometimes loyalty looks bigger than words. Sometimes it looks like an old shepherd waiting at the door until someone finally comes home. And maybe that's the lesson in stories like this. People don't always need perfect answers. Sometimes they just need one reason to keep going another day. So here's a simple question for you. If you were Walter, would you have taken the money and walked away? Type 0 for yes. Type 1 for no. And if this story meant something to you, you're always welcome back here for the next one. There are still more roads, more forgotten people, and more loyal dogs waiting somewhere ahead in the dark.